Yes, we are live.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone to the third meeting of the work group on assessment and funding for school facilities. At today's meeting, we are going to dive into the facilities assessment data in your meeting materials and posted online. Beginning on page 45, there is specific data broken down by LEA. But before we get into the facilities assessment data, we're going to have a presentation from Michael Rubinstein from DLS on gross area baselines. This is an issue that came up briefly at our last meeting. One of the additional charges of the work group is to consider the methods used to establish gross area baselines. And a future meeting, we will be discussing options related to gross area baselines, but we wanted to start with an overview today. If there are any questions, or if there aren't any questions, we can get started. Anyone have a question? Okay. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the work group. I am Michael Rubinstein with the Department of Legislative Services, here to talk about, as you mentioned, gross area baselines with public school construction. The reason we're bringing this up is it is one of the subject of a charge in the statute creating the work group. Next slide. And the charge says that the work group should consider and make recommendations regarding the methods used to establish a gross area baseline and maximum state construction allocation for each public school construction project approved for state funding. That is in the statute that was just passed last year. And there's lots of terminology in here that we're going to walk through. So we can go to the next slide. So the gross area baseline is a major factor in determining how much the state will pay for new or renovated public school buildings. It's a formula-based calculation that establishes the square footage of a new or renovated building that is eligible for state funding. And any square footage that exceeds the gross area baseline is entirely the responsibility of the local government, subject to a variance process that we'll talk about later. But as you can see, that's why this is such an important factor, because this determines how much the state will pay for a school, and anything remaining after that is the local responsibility. Next slide. So the 21st Century School Facilities Act of 2018, which stemmed from the Knott Commission, required a review of the per student square foot allocations used by the Interagency Commission on School Construction. Those square foot allocations had been in place for as long as anybody can remember. They had not been revisited for a long time. And there was some testimony before the commission that those allocations were not in line with the educational specifications used by the School Facility Bureau in the MSDE. And so the charge was to look at the per student square foot allocations in conjunction with the educational specifications used to guide school construction and school design. The IAC approved the new GABs in May of 2019 based on recommendations by a sister work group, the one on educational development specifications. And they replaced the maximum gross area allowance. And the terminology is significant here because the old square foot allocations were considered maximum allocations. And there was really no process for exceeding them in the process of designing schools. The new ones are called baselines, and that is in fact what they are. They are considered baselines, and as you'll see, there is a process by which to approve variance from those baselines. Next slide. So how is it calculated? It begins with enrollment projections. And these really come from the LEAs. The state has no mechanism to develop enrollment projections for individual schools. So when a LEA submits a project to the IAC, it comes with an enrollment projection for that school, which only the LEA can produce. And then it's multiplied, once you get that enrollment projection, it's multiplied by those per student allowable square foot amounts that the IAC approved. And that results in the gross area baseline, which is the total square footage that the state will participate in. So we're going to break these down and talk about each component separately in the next slide. So the enrollment projections, as I mentioned, LEAs do submit a 7-year enrollment projection for the school, including the rationale and basis for the projection. The state has no mechanism for doing their own enrollment projections for an individual school. The LEAs also submit enrollment projections for adjacent schools, which allows the IAC to assess if there's excess capacity in nearby facilities, which can affect the size of the proposed project. And the IAC reviews the LEA's enrollment projection and makes the final determination regarding the projected enrollment. And this is the key factor here, which is the IAC is the final arbiter of how big the school can be from an enrollment perspective. The LEAs provide the data, the IAC reviews that data, and it makes the final determination. And that is where sometimes there is some conflict, some dispute about how big the school needs to be. Next slide. The allowable square feet that we talked about, these are the amounts approved by the IAC at their meeting in 2019. And these are actually not subject to any dispute. The LEAs are quite happy with them in most cases, and you'll see why in a little bit on the next few slides. But you see that varies. There's one amount for regular education students that ranges from 105 to 160 square feet, which varies by level of school and the size of the school. Then there's special education student amounts that also vary by elementary, middle, and high school. And finally, there's a career and technical education allocation that's only for high school students. The next few slides will show how these compare to what was in place before the GABs were approved. Next slide. So for elementary schools, you can see the GABs are the dark line. And you can see pretty much for every size, the GABs allow for more square footage to be supported by state funding than the original maximum gross area allowances at all sides of schools. Next one. For middle school, it's pretty much the same picture, except at the very far end of the size spectrum, the GABs fall below the old allowance. And the last one is the high school. Next slide. Here it's a little bit of a different picture. At the smaller sizes, the GABs support less square footage. At the larger sizes, they support more. Again, these amounts are generally not under dispute. The biggest issue really is the enrollment projections that are used to develop the GAB. Next slide. So what happens once the GAB is calculated, that figure, that space allocation is multiplied by a cost per square foot. This is the amount the IAC approves every year. Every year they review construction costs. They look at inflation measures. They look at the bids going out and how much they cost per square foot. And they set a single figure that is used, one with when they review this, work on the site location, and one without site location. And they use that square foot amount to multiply by the gross area baseline to get what's the total project cost. And then that total project cost is applied to the cost share formula to determine what the state local share breakdown is going to be. So again, the gross area baseline is really the foundation for this calculation, and the enrollment projections are the foundation for that gross area baseline calculation. Next slide. So what are the takeaways? With the gross area baselines, there is a better alignment between the educational specifications for the school design and the funding for those spaces. The state funding supports more square feet than was previously allowed under the old system. The enrollment projections are the foundation of the GAB calculations, and those projections are only available from the LEAs, except that the IAC makes the final determination based on the data provided by the LEAs. And there is a new variance process that allows IAC to approve larger designs based on demonstrated programmatic needs. This is done on a case-by-case basis. When we put together this presentation, there have been only 2 cases of LEAs coming to the IAC with variance requests, and both were approved. And that was based on the particular enrollment mix of those schools and the needs of those schools, and they were both approved. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a really innocent question, Madam Chairman. because I haven't been part of the discussion for a while. The final determination of enrollment. How does the IAC make that if there's a disagreement with the LEA? I mean, on what basis is a decision made?
I mean, I can provide an overview, and then if they want to jump in, I know members of the IAC are here. They can provide maybe more specificity, but basically, you know, the LEA has to submit a rationale for their enrollment projection, so where they get their numbers from. For instance, in some cases, they may say, well, we're building a new school, so we're going to get a lot more private school students coming back to the school from surrounding private schools because they don't want to send their kids to an old school, but a new school they want to send their kids to. So we expect, you know, 200 kids to come from private schools. Well, the IAC can say, well, no, I don't think it's going to be that big based on past experience. We don't think that's going to happen. So there are ways in which the IAC can assess the numbers that the LEAs give them. They also have, as I said, the adjacent school measures. So if there's a lot of capacity in the adjacent schools, they can say, well, you know, there's unused capacity. You don't need to build a school as big as you want because you've got room in other schools nearby. So there are a number of reasons or factors that they can consider in making that determination. If they want to jump in, they can do so.
I think you've covered it pretty well, Michael. It's not black and white ever. The adjacencies, what is adjacent? What are the geographical obstacles between schools? What is the existing capacity in adjacent schools? All of those things we go through on a case-by-case basis. Most of the time, we're able to find a common ground, and everybody agrees, and we move forward.
Okay.
Madam Chair, this is Perry Willis from Cecil County. I have just a couple of questions, if I could.
Okay, can we, I'm going to encourage everybody to use your little yellow hand and put it up so that I can see it in the chat. Perry, before I get to you, Delegate Corman has his hand up, and I'll come back to you, Perry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael, can you just put slide 5 back up real fast? And while you're doing that, let me just note, I mean, I've heard a couple of times from two of you that everybody likes a certain aspect of things, or most of the time we're able to reach an accommodation. And unfortunately, I'm just not sure that reflects everybody's experience. I wish that were true. I don't think it is. So if you look at slide 5 on the adjacency issue. So Mike, I just want to make sure I understand, you know, they'll look at, sorry, slide 5.
Yeah, I don't have control here. There we go.
Sorry, I don't know who's control. I made Michelle or Dana. Thank you. So if they're looking at the adjacency and they see, you know, there's MCPS puts out very specific numbers for their sort of 5 or 6 years. I don't think the one I usually see is 7, but whatever they sort of put out is very granular. And they'll show if a school is under capacity by even as much as 5 students, right? So are you saying if Somerset Elementary, which is also a municipality, not just a county, has room for 5 students, and Bethesda Elementary, you know, is over by 45 students, they'll only approve funding, whatever capacity is needed at Bethesda Elementary for 40 students, under the theory that 5 of those students could be redistricted into Somerset Elementary next door?
No, I'm gonna let the IAC take that one, because that gets into the process.
Thank you, Delegate Corman. I wish it was just that simple, but we typically don't go outside of the attendance boundaries or clusters of schools that are working together. You know, an adjacent school that's outside of a different feeder cluster becomes a different school. And so that's one of those gray areas of adjacency, saying, are those seats available right there? They might be, but does that mean that it becomes a problem for the particular students in the following grades?
Yeah,
So
okay, but let's say but let's say as they do that, both of those schools feed into Westland Middle School and then to BCC High School.
Okay.
So there's no feeder problem. They're in the same cluster.
All right.
So is the theory that they're just supposed to redistrict 5 kids and not get the state support for the infrastructure for those 5 kids?
The short answer would be yes. The capacity is there within that group of facilities to house those students.
Okay, and Michael or Mr. Gorell, whoever wants to answer it, can you just go in a little bit more detail about your 2 variance examples that have, you know, sort of been successfully put into place, what they were, and if you view those as precedents for the future, or is every case sort of as us fancy lawyers would call it, de novo when you're considering it.
Yeah, my recollection is there was one case that had a substantial special education population and had special needs for those students that required more space for mobility and other things. And there was another one that had a big mixture of students with other needs, including ESL and other things. So those particular combinations of enrollments necessitated more space than were allowed.
And so is a county going to be able to come forward and say, this, I'll just make up that it was Anne Arundel County. Anne Arundel County, you yielded this, you allowed them to do this. We want to do the exact same thing and have the higher square footage, or is it going to be every case is going to be starting anew?
But I mean, those are all taken on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome. We have a few people that must be having problems with the yellow hand. I will get to you. We got three questions queued up here, but let's go first to Mr. Willis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my first question is about the enrollment projections. And we've sort of been operating for as long as I've been doing them for Cecil County Public Schools, based on a 3-year average on your history will generate where their projection ends up going for the next 7 years. Is that still the case? Is Maryland Department of Planning still looking at that 3-year historical average that sets the whether or not you're in a growth mode, or whether or not you're going to be flat, or whether or not your enrollment may be declining? Because we all know school construction could be based on whether or not the building is old and needs to be replaced, or it's also based on capacity issues. So I'm sort of curious. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is the LEA provides this enrollment projection, but that number is obviously not made up. It's got to come from some historical average, and we've been using 3-year averages. And there's also there's also information from the Maryland Department of Planning that says they have to agree within 5% of that projection for that 5 to 7 year period. So if we were to show a massive growth, maybe some plan unit developments that were coming into the area, would we still be able to show that coming in, even though the students weren't there yet, or are we staying with the 3-year historical average?
I mean, I think I'm going to let Bob do most of this, but my understanding is that the LEA provides the estimate based on the data they have available to them. So if you're aware of a development coming in that's going to affect enrollment for a particular school, you can include that in your projection and mention that that's why that number is what it is. But I'll let Bob do more detailed.
Yeah, there are two different views. Mr. Willis, you've described the Department of Planning's perception and how you've worked with them on the entire LEA and what the growth is at the LEA. On a project by project basis, we have to get more granular than that agreement within the 5%. And we do look at growth and developments. We really would like to see that these projects are permitted and it's not a wish or desire, and that the seats are going to need to be there for the school. And we try to look out further than 3 or 5, even 7 years. And we try to look backwards at least 5 years, because we think we can see a better trend. I will say that we've been working with the Department of Planning since I've arrived at trying to figure out how we can get in place a GPS system so that we can look at a very micro scale migration, because most of the over and under capacities that are occurring now, we could see if we could watch it on a granular level more and be able to support, I think, LEAs in the planning. The planning is the most important part. Next to that is the maintenance. And so we want to get those two right.
Thank you, Mr. Grell. My second question is centered around one of the variances that Mr. Rubinstein talked about, and that's the square footage for special needs students. And I know that was a square footage that was agreed upon back in 2019, but after going through a pretty developed ed spec process over the last summer and into the fall with Cecil County, I can tell you that that is it possible to look at that number again? That only really adds about 20 square foot per student for special needs students, when those programs, particularly the pullout programs, come with lots of infrastructure, I'll say, lots of equipment, lots of PT and OT equipment. And a lot of times, handicapped students need their own apparatus that they come to school in on lift buses and that type of thing. Is that something that's open for discussion to possibly increase that square footage per student for our special needs population?
Yes, we have been flexible and will continue to be flexible in everything, because we want to build a solution that is the proper solution to support education. That's the only purpose of the facility. So if there are changes that were not foreseeable at the time that we were trying to come up with what the square footage that was required was at the time, we should look at it. As you know, it's not simply about programs. The programs that you're describing have all different types of students, and we have to look at how they lay out in the classroom. That's why it's a deliberate process on a case-by-case basis. And oftentimes it is about special needs. How are we going to support those students without having extra space that we don't have resources to take care of? So yes, we can increase the square footage, but again, it's going to be contingent on available funding, both the state level and the local level. And the IEC, of course, makes the allocations, not the staff.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. Ms. Jose.
Thank you. It's Ms. Joes. Thank you, Mr. Rubinstein, for that. I have two questions. One is, if there is a school district that you are looking at that's crowded and there's a neighboring school that does have capacity, would you ask the school district to rezone and redistrict so there would be no capacity issues? And are we using the same gross area baseline for both renovation and new schools?
My understanding is that the redistricting would not be part of the formula. I think Mr. Gorel mentioned that earlier.
Okay.
From that,
And
go ahead.
would also school districts get any kind of incentives if it was LEED certified sustainable buildings? Would they get extra credit for that? And if a school does not show enrollment projections that are, enrollment projections that are shows overcrowding, would you still consider that for a new school, replacement school based on conditions?
I think that last one's an IAC question. Regarding the LEED certified, there is a requirement in state law for new schools to be LEED silver or equivalent. There was funding provided at the early stages of that requirement, but that has since expired a number of years ago. So there is no incentive for that anymore. It is just a straight requirement now.
And I might add, if I can jump in here, these are all issues that we can take up at a later meeting when we get into the discussion. But they're all good questions. Are you finished, by the way?
I think Bob was
Just
maybe
one
Bob can
question,
answer
I think, to Mr.
Okay.
Gorel.
Yeah.
Could you restate that question so that I understand?
If a school does not show any enrollment projections or overcrowding, would you still consider that school for a new replacement school or addition?
Oh, yes. Yes. I wanted to make sure I understood. So you've got sufficient capacity at the school, but it might be completely run down to the point where it's very expensive to operate or it's not a good educational environment. We'll soon have FCI scores for all LEAs throughout the state. Those will look like 70% or better probably on the FCI measure. That's a school that it most likely is going to be more effective in the long run. It's half the cost to build a school, half the cost over 30, 40 years to keep the school in good condition. That second half is the part that we've been struggling with, having the dollars for that maintenance capital operation in that. So yes, oftentimes it makes a lot more sense to even replace an old school than to fully renovate it if it's going to bring down the total cost of ownership and support the educational process properly.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. County Executive Gardner.
Thank you. My question is pretty simple on the enrollment piece. I will concur with Perry that while the LEAs provide the enrollment projections, we do have to have concurrence from the Maryland Department of Planning. So there is a component of state that has to support that. But has the enrollment, how enrollment's considered, changed? Based on these slides, it appears it hasn't changed. So that's just.
No, it hasn't. I'm sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead.
No, it really hasn't changed.
Okay.
But the fact that we have a population migration and changes are speeding up. As we have multinationals in neighborhoods and that aggregate into an area, we're seeing really rapid changes in the number of kids that may go to one school versus another. And so we're trying to get ahead of that. I'll say that one county that has had declining population generally, when we look at it from the Department of Planning level, on the individual neighborhood level, they have growth. And so it's really important for us to look at this more granularly and understand it so that we get the proper solutions in place.
All right, thank you. The other question I have is, certainly I think it's positive that the gross area baseline has increased and that gap has closed. So I thank you and the members of the IAC for that. But it's my understanding that the gross area baseline doesn't consider or include space for pull out space for English language learners, for math and reading intervention, for speech therapy, for community liaisons, and for some regional special education programs. So if we could we have a discussion about making recommendations on those, because I do think some of that space is consistent with what was recommended in the blueprint. And related to that, I know there's a new variance process. Is that defined somewhere? Is that a cumbersome process? Can you address what that process is?
Well, I'm sorry.
That's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chair. But I'll take that answer.
It's a very deliberate process. It's one that requires layout of classrooms, showing circulation, how the room's going to be used. It's not something that's simple, and it shouldn't be. We build a building that's going to last for 30 to 50 years, and we have to take care of it, and it has to go through. And if it's not in good condition, it's no matter how you build it, it's not going to be a good learning environment. So yes, we look at it very carefully. The gross area baseline should include everything that you describe. Traditionally, it can. If there are new things that have added on in that require additional square footage, are there things that are no longer as necessary in a school that are not needed? And that's the modern way that we have to look at school facilities. So this is a baseline. And I'll contrast that against some of the IEC's practices that were not well defined, but guidelines turned into requirements. They were never intended to. The EdSpec Workgroup made that very clear, that guidelines need to be presented as guidelines. This is the size of a library, for instance, and that it's not a requirement of the LEA at all. So the gross area baselines are a footprint for the LEA to design and use however it wishes. We would like to be hands-off and learn from the innovation that occurs at the local level. It won't come from us on how to best support education. And of course, at the local level, the lower the total cost of ownership, the more money it's left over for teachers and maintenance and operations. So that's how it works. But if you can't make it work within that gross area baseline, we're going to be right there to go through that struggle with you. And if, following up on Delegate Corman's follow-up question, if over time we are repeating adding square footage for this particular configuration and number of students and programs, we'll change the gross area baseline or make a set of easy to under documents that follow what we've learned.
Okay. Jan, are you fine with that?
I think I understood it, but I thought maybe I heard you say that these things that I mentioned were included in the gross area baseline, or they're appealable. Is that what you're saying?
Both. Yes, we believe that most of the things that are being asked for can be provided. Of course, we have new kindergarten space in the Kerwin in pre-K, that those things, you're not going to squeeze those new kids into existing spaces. We understand that. So we will have to adjust the gross area baselines once we better understand, what the requirements are. But everything is appealable. It's in COMAR, and that's why it's there, so that we can build a school. That's the solution to the problem that we're trying to solve, and we want it to work every time.
Okay, so the areas I listed are not in the gross area baseline, but they're appealable through that variance process.
If they can't work within that gross square footage, I'll use Frederick as an example. In your new high school, some of the spaces you built smaller than you have in other counties, I should say. And because of that, you were able to provide a culinary arts space in that. And all of that whole school is within the new gross area baselines, because of good planning and good work on the ed spec level, watching the budget, watching the total size of the facility to come up with an outcome that works for all the programs.
Okay. All right, thank you. And Michael, thank you for your presentation as well.
Thank you.
We're going to, I see no other questions, we're going to move now to a presentation on facilities assessment and educational sufficiency standards. And Bob Gorell, Executive Director of the IAC, Alex Donahue, Deputy Director, along with Tom Bart and Bill Champion are going to do this presentation. So Bob, you want to lead it off?
Thank you. I really appreciate your time here and your support. And I look forward to talking with each of you offline as well, if there are additional questions that didn't get answered here today. I will turn this over to Alex. Alex has been managing this assessment program. It is a big push. It's successful so far, as we've reported previously. Alex, please.
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the work group. It's very good to see you here again after our break between meetings. And I'm happy to be presenting some of the next information pertaining to the statewide facilities assessment. And with me today from our contractor Bureau Veritas are Bill Champion, who is the project manager, and Tom Bart, the IT manager. Today, we'll go through data on both facility condition and educational sufficiency, as well as how they can be combined. You've received a packet of materials that contains 4 slides for each LEA and a set for the state overall. We will refer to these as we proceed through our presentation today and are happy to take questions about the materials after we complete the presentation. Next slide. Before we jump into the data once again, though, we'd like to take a moment to describe the data set and how we went about obtaining it. The data set we've begun building with this baseline assessment is truly massive, containing more than 250,000 asset records and millions of data points. Refining this data down to simple comparable metrics is extremely complex and challenging. Some of the data points were submitted by the LEAs, some were collected by BV's on-site assessors, and some are the result of calculations using starting assumptions designed to fit the bulk of the 1,400 facilities covered here. As you can imagine, with a data set this large, there is some margin of error. The data set has been QC'd, quality controlled, extensively, with every LEA providing feedback on data points collected, and we anticipate that over time the data will be improved as the IAC and the LEAs continue to identify discrepancies and ways to obtain more accurate data. The data set is a living, not fixed data set that has been configured for continuous refinement and improvement through periodic, fresh on-site assessments, and as a result of new or deeper data that the LEAs provide as they make changes to their facilities over time. Next slide, please. The first step in the process was that the IAC generated a starter school inventory from our facility inventory database, which the IAC maintains, but the LEAs populate and update on an annual basis. The second phase involved having the LEAs confirm the inventory and provide a starting set of data for each facility, including information such as lists of assets with attributes and lists of spaces and their use assignments, floor plans, and the like. They provided information to the extent possible, Each LEA is different in how they keep their information. Some LEAs had more electronically, some had it on paper in a single location, and the assessors went out and scanned the information to bring it into the database. Next, BV's assessors visited each school, measured and confirmed the data on the spaces in the facility, and assessed the condition of those spaces and the building systems. Finally, BV and the LEAs engaged in a quality assurance quality control process in which the LEA reviewed the collected data on screen and provided any corrections, notes, or comments as they liked. Next slide, please. BV reviewed and accepted the LEA's corrections, or in a very small percentage of cases, kept the data as collected and provided an explanation to the LEA. Throughout, the LEAs were able to request meetings to discuss the data, and in many cases did. Finally, in late August, the IAC sent each LEA the FCI, or Facility Condition Index, data on each of their schools, and is following up by sending the LEAs the data on the FCIs for each building system in their facilities later this week. As we know, next slide, please. Actually, I'll hand it to Bob for a comment here.
Thank you, Alex. As we know, a facility's condition is never static. Sometimes it changes slowly, sometimes it changes quite rapidly in the space of minutes, such as when the tornado hit Anne Arundel Cat South building earlier this month and damaged it. In light of this changeability, the data set has been designed to be intentionally constructed to be changeable so that we can keep it current. This means that information presented here will be continually improved over time, and the numbers here are not set in stone. They are best possible view at this time and will be used to create the baseline assessment. We will go forward and we'll be able to adjust and update the data points wherever necessary, such as when the LEA modifies a facility, replaces a building component. And once each year, we will run a point-in-time snapshot. And that will be useful for many purposes, as well as to have longitudinally comparative data from year to year. Each year going forward, there will be a 6 to 9 month long process in which the IAC will update the data on every school. Approximately 25% of the schools will be assessed using boots on the ground, and the remaining 75% will have their data mathematically aged by 1 year. The IAC will incorporate changes to the database upon any major changes the LEA makes to facilities, such as through replacement of buildings, renovations, in addition. Now let's get back to the data itself. Bill?
Thank you, Bob. As we discussed in our last meeting, to properly understand the needs of the state with regard to the school facilities, we must look at and quantify both the physical condition and the educational sufficiency of each facility. In our last meeting, we discussed the initial draft condition data at the statewide level for both facilities and major building systems. Today, we'll look at the condition of the facilities and major building systems at the LEA level. Here, I must emphasize that this data set is preliminary and will change over time. After we've gotten a picture of the physical condition of each LEA's portfolio, we'll shift to examining the educational sufficiency. For the first part of today's presentation, we'll focus only on the physical condition. Next slide, please. The physical condition is measured using the Facility Condition Index score, or FCI score. It reflects the percentage of the expected lifespan that has been depleted to date. We calculated for each major building system and then weight and average those percentages to obtain a facility-wide FCI figure. Next slide, please. Because the FCI is the percentage depleted, a lower FCI percentage number means a better condition. 0% equals brand new, and 100% equals fully used up. Next slide, please. This slide shows the weighted average portfolio FCI by LEA. This is the average perceived condition you're likely to experience if you walk into one of the schools. The fact that these LEA averages are in the 40s and 50s shows that there are some individual schools that have much higher FCIs. Next slide, please. In the materials you received, you'll see a separate bar chart for each LEA that shows the number of schools in that LEA within each of the FCI bands, just as we see here in this slide. We do talk about the FCI as a percentage figure because the depletion can't exceed 100%. Here, the FCIs are shown as decimals, but in the future, we'll show them as percentages to be more consistent and make it clearer. Next slide, figure. Now we're going to drill down to the building system level. This slide shows the statewide average FCI or depletion level for each of the major building systems. In the materials provided, you'll find this data for each LEA represented on bar charts. These depleted lifespan figures are observed, not calculated. Importantly, as a rule of thumb, individual building systems that cross the 60% observed FCI threshold begin to degrade much more rapidly when they're younger. So a facility owner should plan and budget for that systems replacement in the near future. Here you see that the depletion level varies by system. The depletion level for foundations and structure is lower in part because those systems last longer than most others in a facility. The depletion level for flooring is highest because many flooring types have a relatively short lifespan and get a lot of wear and tear. Before we move on to take a look at the data on educational sufficiency, we'd like to pause to consider any questions you may have about the condition data. Any questions on condition data? All right.
Any questions? Any questions? Okay.
Okay.
Very
All
good. Thank
right,
you.
next slide. Now that we reviewed the preliminary data on the physical condition of the building systems and facilities, I'll turn it back over to Alex to present some information about the educational sufficiency of the facilities.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Over the last next slide, please. Great. Over the last 2 decades, standards and assessments have become very important components of our education system because they encourage accountability and effectiveness. Without measures, improvement is not likely, and the same holds true in the area of school facilities. School facilities' sole purpose is to support the delivery of education. Facilities themselves cannot teach. It's teachers that teach, of course, while school facilities must at the least provide a sufficient learning environment. The IAC's mission is to achieve a safe, healthy, and educationally sufficient learning environment for every child in every seat in Maryland. But if we cannot measure something, we cannot efficiently address any deficiencies that might exist. This is one reason why it's been a really special privilege for me as a former public school teacher and high school principal to have been involved in the development of the Maryland Educational Facilities Sufficiency Standards and to see their application now in this statewide assessment. The standards, which are included in your materials and are also available as shown here on the IAC's website, are what we use as the yardstick for the sufficiency portion of the statewide assessment. The standards describe the minimum attributes that each functional area of a public pre-K-12 school facility should have in order to support the delivery of the state-required educational programs that the LEA must deliver in those spaces. The purpose of the standards is to provide a set of standards against which to compare the attributes of existing facilities in order to identify deficiencies that an LEA should consider for remediation. They are the measuring stick we use to repeatably and comparably identify needs. I must note that the standards are not mandatory. They do not mandate that an LEA remediate any given deficiency immediately, nor do they prescribe any specific solution. This is because there's often a range of possible solutions. The solution that's best in a given case will depend on the specifics of that case and how it interrelates with the rest of the issues in a school and also with the rest of the schools in the LEA's portfolio. The standards also are not guidelines for designing facilities. The standards do not describe what an LEA might or should build into a new facility. When we evaluate a proposed renovation or a new school design for state funding, the IAC uses the gross area baselines, which serve as the baseline or starting point for determining the state participation in a major project. As we mentioned before, as Michael presented, the gross area baselines allow each LEA to determine how to best use the eligible square footage to serve a given student population. Next slide, please. The standards can be grouped into two categories, space and space attributes. Deficiencies of space, as measured against the sufficiency standards, are registered in a facility's scores by counting the missing square footage and multiplying it by the replacement value of the square footage, which for this valuation process was set at $400 per square foot. And we'll come back with an additional detail in the next couple of slides about the space here. On the attributes, the standards specify minimums or ranges of values for lighting, temperature, relative humidity, ambient noise, and air quality, as measured by the concentration of carbon dioxide. When assessors find problems in these areas that are substantial and widespread throughout the facility, the remaining useful lifespan of the relevant building system is adjusted down to reflect its insufficiency. Of special note would be air conditioning, which is handled separately and will be described in more detail later in this presentation. And next, Bill will describe how the process works with regard to space sufficiency.
Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. With regard to spaces evaluated, this slide shows the spaces that are measured for sufficiency. In many cases, the standards specify a minimum total square footage for each space type on a per student basis. For some spaces, the standards specify a flat minimum number of square feet. And in a few cases, the standards specify that the school simply have that space type without specifying the size. Examples of these are playfields, unpaved recreation areas, or hard surface sports courts. The standards also specify a minimum number of parking spaces based upon the number of staff and, at the high school level, the projected enrollment. Next slide, please. This slide shows the minimum square footage required for a sample set of spaces per the standards for a high school with a base enrollment of 1,500 students. Taking general classrooms as an example, the standards specify a minimum of 25 square feet per student at the high school level, multiplied by the 1,500 students, generating a school-wide minimum requirement of 37,500 square feet for general classrooms. Tom?
Thank you, Bill. Next slide, please. In calculating deficiencies related to space, the first step is to project the fifth-year future enrollment. And we use the fifth-year future enrollment because the theory is it takes an average of about 5 years to plan, design, and construct new facility space. So we need to look at least 5 years out to identify the level of enrollment that's required. The default method, which fits the majority of the schools, is to project the fifth-year future enrollment using a straight line projection from current and the previous 4 years enrollment values. This slide shows the math for the past 5 years of enrollments and how they generate a growth factor that's applied to last year's enrollment to generate the fifth-year future enrollment. So you can say in this example, there's a yearly rate of growth change. That's the formula that amounts to a growth factor of 1.02. And when you multiply 1472 by 1.02, you get an enrollment 5 years out of 1502. Not very significant in this example. Sometimes it is more significant. Because LEAs vary in how they calculate their projected enrollment, the straight line method allows us to compare future growth in an apples to apples basis across the state, which is really essential in terms of prioritizing facility needs. I also note that the growth factor is not calculated at less than 1 in any case, so space needs are not reduced for a school that currently has a declining enrollment. If an LEA believes that this method produces an enrollment that doesn't really reflect the reality 5 years from now, they can suggest alternative numbers with an explanation. And the IEC can then enter a revised enrollment projection. And actually that has been done with a number of schools where the enrollment situation has been changing significantly due to some sort of anomaly or redistricting or some sort of abnormal growth pattern. Next slide, please. Next, we multiply the projected enrollment by the minimum square footage per student listed in the sufficiency standards. And that gives us a value for the minimum space requirement for that space type. We then subtract the actual measured square foot for each space type from the minimum required to determine whether there's a space deficiency for that type of space. There's also an adjustment made for open plan classroom space of 20% to account for circulation areas such as file cabinets and space dividers. So this would mean, in theory, that open plan schools end up with less usable space and are more likely to have a space deficiency in the general classroom type, space type. Finally, we add all the space deficiencies into a total space deficiency figure for the facility. And it's important to note here that space deficiencies are only netted out against the extra space found in that space type, not against extra space found in other types of space in the facility. And that's because not every type of space can functionally substitute for another type of space. In other words, a general classroom cannot suffice for a science classroom, let's say, as an example. So excess square footage in one space can offset a deficiency in another space of the same type. In other words, if you have a large classroom and a small classroom, that's acceptable. However, excess square footage in different types generally is not permitted by the statutes or by the standards rather. Next slide, please. So in the data, we see that in aggregate statewide, about 64% or almost 2/3 of the space-related deficiencies are due to classroom type spaces. And then there's 36% that are non-classroom type spaces, support spaces and the like. Next slide. So in the statewide assessment, relocatables and modulars are counted separately so we can treat them differently in the data set. So for the purposes of the study, relocatables are freestanding structures that can relatively easily be moved to another site. And the expected remaining useful life, expected useful life is 15 years. We expect it to last 15 years with proper maintenance. Modular spaces typically are larger, a little bit more permanent, generally 24 feet and on a foundation, and generally can't be moved, at least not easily. And they tend to be a little bit more permanent. And so the the expected useful life is set at 20 years for those systems. So as shown on the pie chart on the slide, the assessment found a total of about 1 million square feet of relocatables and just under 2 million square feet in modular classrooms. And those numbers are about 2% and 5% respectively of the total current classroom square footage for the entire state. Each separate relocatable and modular building is assessed as a building system and assigned a remaining useful lifespan and an FCI or condition figure. This allows us to know how worn out each relocatable or modular is, how they're progressing within their life cycle, and to count the depletion of the condition and the overall condition score for the facility. In addition, when the remaining useful lifespan of a modular relocatable attains 0 remaining useful years, the square footage then becomes counted as a space deficiency as well within the general classroom type space. And this means that while a modular relocatable is in what should be a decent and usable condition, it is counted as sufficient space. Once it is worn out, however, it is not counted as sufficient space, and that space deficiency then contributes more heavily to the facility's deficiency level. The condition data shows that statewide, 11% of relocatables and about 10% of modular buildings have remaining useful lives of 0, and so can be considered to be not sufficient space currently. And the good news is that these worn out relocatables and modulars amount to less than 316,000 total square feet out of about 42 million square feet of classroom space across the state, or about 0.7%. The bad news is that if these classrooms that are worn out still need to serve students, there's a solution that needs to be implemented in the near term. Next slide, thank you. And this slide shows the unweighted values of the space deficiency statewide broken out by space type. And in your materials, you will have a slide that provides a breakdown of space deficiencies by space type for each LEA. In each slide, the space types are sorted by the space deficiency amounts. So they won't be in the same order for each LEA. So just note that. As noted, the largest deficit generally is in general classroom space, with the second largest deficit in the area of gyms, cafeterias, auditoriums collectively.
Thanks, Tom. Here, I'd like to emphasize that the sufficiency standards and any data on related deficiencies do not suggest any solutions. The data are only the first level in helping us get a start on quantifying the needs that are out there. But there are still many layers and levels of information needed. Just because we find that a school is short on classroom space does not necessarily mean that the school district should add more classrooms to that school. In a given case, there may be a number of potential solutions to this apparent shortage of space, ranging from repurposing other types of space in the school that might currently be underutilized, to realigning attendance zones to shift some demand to nearby schools that have unused seats. Within a portfolio context, the right solution can only be found after analysis of all the relevant factors, as well as their related costs and benefits. And this is something that LEAs do all the time as part of their portfolio planning. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, backup one. You're ahead of me. Great. Thanks. For relevancy, and as we noted at the beginning of the presentation, we combine the FCI figures with sufficiency data to create a combined facility score that reflects the physical condition and educational sufficiency of each facility. This allows for two things. First, it allows us to properly include in a single score all the key factors that count in and describe the aspects of the facility that affect the delivery of educational programs and services. And second, it allows the facilities to be compared against each other in a fair manner to identify those with the greatest total deficiencies and therefore to determine the highest needs in the state. Next slide, please. We know that not every deficiency in a facility has the same impact on teachers and students. Items that are old but functioning reliably often have little or no negative impact on teaching and learning. But an overcrowded space or a failed ventilation system can have a huge and immediate impact. For this reason, the assessment is configured with 9 categories or buckets so that we can categorize every deficiency, whether it is one of condition or one of educational sufficiency, by its relevancy to the delivery of education. This allows the state to get a grip on the huge and complex world that is the statewide portfolio of nearly 1,400 facilities. I won't read the entire list, but we'll point out a couple of key features. First, this list incorporates buckets for both condition and sufficiency. The 5 buckets in blue here pertain primarily to condition issues, while the ones in white pertain more to sufficiency and other standards-related issues. Category 1 covers those deficiencies that pose a threat to the life, safety, or health of facility users, or can affect the usability of the facility for education such that it must be closed and students and staff sent home. Categories 3, 4, and 5 cover condition problems that range from not currently serious to very consequential. Category 9 is where we log the depletion amounts for all building systems that are within their expected useful lifespans and do not require replacement. This category allows these systems' depletion to be logged and taken into account, but not overemphasized beyond their actual relevance to teaching and learning at this time. Deficiencies of space, which is category 2, are separated from deficiencies relating to other aspects of the building or its equipment, which are caught in category 7 and 8. And Tom?
Thank you, Alex. Next slide, please. So for those who appreciate visual roadmaps, we have the next 4 slides really talk about what I like to refer to as wiring diagrams. Basically how we use the data to ultimately inform the metrics that we've talked about so far. So this slide gives an overview of how the condition and sufficiency data feed into the various buckets, which effectively then merge the 2 types of data, condition and sufficiency. You have facility data that obviously informs an FCI, and then you have both facility data and space data that, when applied or measured through these sufficiency standards, then filter into a group of 9 different categories that can be given different weightings to achieve sort of a prioritization and ultimately a combined facility score. On the next slide, we're taking it to a little bit of a deeper level, so a little bit more detail. It's essentially the same slide, but we're showing some of the details that go into the FCI and what's churned through the sufficiency standards to arrive at those different categories. So you can see we have the population values year 1 through 5. They achieve the growth factor, which we've already discussed. We have some facility data related to certain systems that are related to sufficiency. And then obviously we have the space related data. The expected useful lifespan and effective age or remaining useful lifespan of each building system factor into the condition measure or FCI, which is then weighted by the cost of replacement. So the relative value of the deficiency it represents is known and can be compared fairly against other deficiencies. On the sufficiency side, the enrollments for the last 5 years generate a growth factor, and then when combined with the sufficiency standards, do generate those items that can be bracketed into the various buckets. The next slide is probably the third level of detail here. And it shows how the building system lifespan data is evaluated and categorized. The first question, we essentially set up a decision tree for the assessment team to be able to then allocate the data appropriately. So the first question is the system beyond its expected useful lifespan currently? And if it's not, then it's simply lodged in category 9 so that its depletion can be taken into account and tracked, but it's not really given a whole lot of importance because it's within its life cycle and performing. But if the answer is yes, then the depletion is lodged into a category that reflects how it ultimately is impacted. And you can see where it is extremely old, greater than twice its expected life, that's considered automatically to be contributing to potential mission impact. And then whether or not it's a critical system is also applied as well. And lastly, on the next slide, in addition to lifespan measurements, building systems are also flagged as to whether they constitute a deficiency of another sort that qualifies them for being treated especially and perhaps with a greater prioritization. First and foremost, of course, are issues related to life, health, safety, or facility usability. And items that are damaging other systems, consider a roof that's leaking and then damaging flooring and ceilings and walls, for example, or electrical systems, they would then go into category 3. Items that don't meet current codes or standards, but are grandfathered, are separated into their own category. And the absence of needed kitchen equipment or parking spaces go into category 7. Missing playground equipment and other sufficiency related equipment could go into category 8. And Bill, next.
Thank you, Tom. Next slide, please. All right. This slide shows a breakdown of issues found by category. The data set shows that in terms of the estimated values of the deficiencies, nearly 3/4 of all deficiencies, about 74%, are recognizing the normal depletion of existing building systems, which are within their expected lifespans and do not need replacement. Another 18% of the deficiencies are systems that are older than their expected lifespan, but are functioning and are not causing a problem at this time. Together, those two categories amount to about 92%. About 6% of the deficiencies are missing space in one of the space types we previously discussed. 71 items, or a tenth of percent of all of the deficiencies, are critical issues that appear to pose threats to life, safety, health, or facility usability. Next slide, please. This slide provides a list of the issues making up the 71 category 1 issues, broken out by building system component. Of note here is that the air conditioning system, which is the first entry at the top of the list, indicates that there were 32 schools in which 20% or more of the classrooms were not air conditioned. The sufficiency standards require that each general and specialty classroom have an HVAC system capable of maintaining a temperature between 68 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity between 30 and 60% at full occupancy. The rationale behind the 20% threshold is that where there are fewer than 20% of the classrooms that are not air conditioned, it is likely to be possible to shift some classes temporarily to spaces in the school where there are air conditioning when the temperatures are too high, without having to close the entire school and send students home when 4/5 of the students are not adversely impacted. All right. However, no, sorry, not yet. However, 20% of the classrooms are unair conditioned. It's more than likely the school will be closed for the day. The remainder of the issues are related to system components that pose a threat to occupants or the facility's usability, including a failed fire alarm system, dangerous electrical switchgear, trip hazards, or crumbling masonry. Alex?
Thanks, Bill. Now we return, next slide, to the list of categories with the condition-related ones primarily in blue and the sufficiency-related ones in white to make them available for discussion on potential prioritization. I understand, Madam Chair, that you were looking at that topic next.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, however, that I
Absolutely.
want to get to. County Executive Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome.
I'd like to go back to your slide number 16 on calculating space deficiencies. And if you're going to use a straight line projection to go out to fifth year enrollments, it's my understanding that most school systems, and ours for instance, use a cohort survival method. And so can you explain to me why you're not using a cohort survival method? Because for areas where there's growing enrollment, using the straight line method is going to definitely understate the enrollment projections, and maybe severely so. So that's my first question.
I could take that question.
Sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is a place to start. It's a baseline so that we have a place of beginning to understand what is necessary in a school. And the straight line, of course, accommodates cohort, because if it's a stable neighborhood, cohort projections are very predictable as far as enrollment from one class to the other over time. If you have increases in younger enrollment, those increases will come through as a bubble. And I think that's what you're talking about, Ms. Gardner, in that bubble might show up in the elementary school, that if we're talking about that, or a mid school that occurred 5 years ahead of time that we didn't see the bubble coming. That's why whenever we give the data back to the LEAs, they can make us aware of these differences. This is just an easy, quick way to get a baseline so that we are managing for the exceptions. It's a very big assessment throughout the entire state, and it allows then accurate information to be adjusted if necessary. And we did make changes on that. Bill, I think you spoke in the presentation of making some adjustments.
Yeah, there is the opportunity for an override in cases where the straight line doesn't meet the need.
If I may, Madam Chair, a second issue involved in this is that the LEAs use different enrollment projection methodologies across the state. And because the state does not have the ability to do enrollment projections at the school level, we have to use in the CIP process, LEA provided enrollments. But when we're doing a statewide comparison where we need the calculations to be apples to apples, we would have far too much variation, and we wouldn't even know exactly what caused the variations if we were to use, for example, LEA enrollment projections in the statewide assessment. We would never end up with apples to apples. So this straight line provides us with that. But again, it is a starting point, and it has been varied and modified whenever the LEA says we have for example, a redistricting that just took effect in this area or is planned to take effect in this area in the next couple of years. And so the straight line does not actually predict what is actually going to happen. And we can dig right into that. We made a number of changes with specific schools for that reason in this assessment.
Right. Well, I think that, things just aren't apples to apples. And so there can be changes in birth rates as well as new developments anticipated, as well as other types of trends. So I just think straight line misses a lot of that. So I'm not sure I understand what the apples to apples component of that, why that's relevant to you. But I'll move on to the next question that I have.
Sure.
Which is related to relocatables. And I know that you consider relocatables sufficient space until they're 15 years old. And I did have a conversation offline with Bob Gorell about how, portables are something most of us want to get rid of and before they get to be 15 years old. And so I think that, it's important for us to understand how overcrowding feeds into this. And if overcrowding isn't considered until that portable is more than 15 years old.
You want to take that?
I will. Yes, the relocatables are for those anomalies that we don't understand. And this is back to the migration that we seem to have very rapidly in areas of schools, where something makes an area more attractive for some reason or the other. And we have more growth than we expected whenever we are planning the school, we build the school, and more students show up than we are expecting. I want to make a kind of a side point on the projections of 5 years backwards and looking forward. We are using those so that we can try to discern what the highest needs are from one school to another, whether it's in that LEA or another LEA, with reasonable data. And it is not going to define how many students that would be allowed if that is determined to be a high need that the state should participate in, and it becomes a project, at which time we've got to really drill into the details to figure this out. But let's say we did that and we increased the population because it seemed to be a fast growing school, and we thought we were building it right or planning it right. We build the school 5 years later, or even 2 years after we open the school, we have all of these students show up and we've got to do something with them. We put a relocatable in place. It's a solution that allows housing for those students, and it is sufficient housing at the time that it's put in. Maybe because there's no other choices, but it is sufficient housing. And in which case we try to make it up on the next one. If there's an administrative solution, that might be in the next school has more capacity and those students are shifted into that school, and we can get rid of the relocatables at that point. But it to drive the solution, in other words, to cause an addition to go onto that school when you've got growth that might not be fully understood, might not be the best solution. But the point is that relocatables are considered sufficient by teachers and principals. And I know when we talked, I shared that the National Center for Educational Statistics did a very large study on this and found that, in fact, they are, for most teachers and principals, they prefer them. And I'm not to say that your county prefers them, but if there's another unhoused student somewhere else, then are those dollars more valuable for the unhoused student than a student that we will eventually get rid of the relocatable over time? And this is a matter of opinion, but it's just the way that we have looked at them makes that option. However this work group decides to treat them, we have collected the data so that it's available to treat them however you like.
Well, just as an observation, we get a lot of complaints when we open a new school and it opens overcrowded. And one of the reasons it may open overcrowded is because we're using a straight line average to justify the number of seats we're going to cost share in a school, rather than that cohort method. And so, but I'm really concerned that, like when you get to page 27, where you say space deficiency is 6.2% of the issues, is that understating the issue because you're considering portables to be adequate space? And most parents don't consider portables to be adequate space for lots of reasons. And I know there's differences of opinion on that, but for most of us sitting out here in elected office, we're trying to put kids into sides of a school building.
Understand.
So the only other question I'll ask is, because I know I ask a lot of questions, is in category 1, threats to life, safety, health, or facility usability, where you list examples on page 28, which I assume that's not a fully exhaustive list. But does that include well and septic? Because in well and septic, you could have issues that shut down a school. If you have 700 kids in a school that has a septic system built for 400, that would have its challenges. And I've never seen well and septic on a list, so I thought to ask that.
Yes, you're right, and that's why we have used the terminology in category 1. Anything that can shut down a school is going to be a life safety. Kids can't go to the school if they can't drink water, they can't go to the bathroom. That certainly is a problem. I'm not aware that there were any of those issues brought to our attention that are in the database, and I would defer to Tom or Bill on that. I did not see any.
Okay.
We did not have any issues that with the plumbing system accounted for in the RULs that were the plumbing is past the life or usability of the school.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I appreciate your answers. And I hope in the future, Madam Chair, we can come back and talk about portables again.
Okay.
Efficiency of portables, because I think that's a broader issue. Some other issues.
And Madam Chair, I just need to assure all of your members that we don't use straight line projections whenever we are determining the enrollment at a project school, either in the IEC currently, or I foresee anything in the future. That straight line is only used as a way to have as Alex said, a common way to look at things, to compare one school against another. And it can be challenged, and it has been challenged. So if any of the members or anybody listening feels like the growth factors that we've used don't properly represent their school, let us know. As I said earlier, this is dynamic data. We can make adjustments.
Thank you. Mr. Willis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is real quick. Bob, just for my clarification here, relocatables beyond the useful life of 15 years goes into category 5 or goes into category 9?
Currently, we have set up the system because we understand how that, and all of this is flexible. The system is intended to be adjustable so that we can do the will of this work group, the legislature, and the governor. So currently, we've set this up so that whenever a relocatable reaches 15 years, regardless of its remaining useful life, it now is going to be counted as an insufficient space, and which has a higher value as far as the MDCI score, the Maryland Condition Index score, has a higher value than the repair or the replacement value of that.
So that score would automatically be a 0.99, and that would factor right into the total building's FCI score.
No, and I'm going to default this over to Tom, who has set the system up, so I don't say something wrong. But the intent is that
I'm not trying to trip you up.
No, I understand. But this is a complex system. There's lots of data. Tom, could you please?
Absolutely. So while the relocatable or the modular is within its life cycle, it will count in FCI up to the point of 0.99, to your point, Mr. Willis, until it reaches 0 remaining years. Once it achieves 0 remaining years, it ceases to count in the FCI and then is transferred over to category 2 as a space deficiency. And the reason we pull it out of the FCI at that point is we're not double counting the impact of that overall deficiency. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it somewhat does, because if relocatables are going to have that much weight, particularly when you could have a building with 10 or 11 of them on your site, and yet the building itself is in great condition and has lots of useful life, it could be setting it could be throwing your percentage higher than it needs to be, is all I'm saying. So So I don't know if there's like, you could do a separation factor for relocatables that are beyond 15 years that exceed a certain square footage on the building, or, and the other thing, let's make a comment on relocatables. Sometimes they're not driven by enrollment factors. They're driven by programmatic requirements, programs at high schools for equity. You might have one school that needs to offer another AP class or a different type of curriculum that one other school might not have. And so relocatables show up to provide a new teacher with a space that's providing a program that's brand new. And so I don't want that to throw, I would not want that to throw into a FCI score when it was a programmatic requirement that we had additional space. Does that make sense?
Madam Chair, I can say that we've set this up so that we can weight these however you feel it's appropriate. If on Mr. Willis's point, if we want to weight them less than we have currently played with it, we can absolutely do that.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. And Senator McCray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Director Guerrero. Just been a robust discussion in reference to the enrollment. If you could speak to, I think it was Tom that was laying out, once a LEA states what their enrollment is and what the projections are, they can then, the IEC then says whether they agree with them or not. Then if they disagree, the LEA provides an explanation. Could you speak to what percentage actually triggers to that explanation point? So is it 10, is it 50, is it 90% of folks that meet that trigger of the explanation? And also, do you track that information too? Like, do you kind of track it once that explanation point kind of triggers?
Thank you, Senator McCray. I think that there were two conversations that we had that tended to overlap. On the first one with the assessment, we were talking about the 5-year straight projection, looking backwards, projecting out to the forward, and to have a challenge to us. We're going to look at it. We're going to ask why, give us something that we can have for the file, but it's not awarding a project at this time. It's just, it would increase the insufficient space if the enrollment were higher, obviously. The other question that we talked about in detail was at the beginning, and that was on the gross area baseline. And that's also driven by enrollment. And in that, it is a project. The project has come to the IEC. Currently, it would be under the CIP or the Build to Learn. In the future, it could come under, if this database is used to prioritize funding, it could come under the priority fund, which is possible. And in which case we would be looking at the enrollment the same way across all 3 programs. And we would say, what is your enrollment? And the LEA could say, well, here's our enrollment. And we'd say, that's fine. And then we start looking at existing capacity, because we have a responsibility to ensure that we don't have more than we can take care of, more than that's necessary, because they're competing, there's limited resources and everybody needs it. We just don't have enough. So we look at adjacencies to see what the adjacent schools are. And it's a process. We look at growth factors in that individual community to see what's happening in that community that may be causing changes in growth. We look to see if there is an administrative solution to maybe move students from one to another. What is the condition of the school that we would move those kids into? We don't want to move them into a worse. So it's a back and forth process. And yes, we keep those all in a file, and that is the project file for that particular school, that project that came through the process, whether it's Build to Learn, CIP, or something else.
So you answered the second part of the question, but the first part of the question, how many disagree with your first assessment of their enrollment? Like, what percentage? Is that something that's normal? Is that something that we see from all of our LEAs, or no, this is something that's unique? Only 10%, 15% actually disagree with your first set of enrollment projections.
I can't give you what that percentage is. Alex, do you have a wild guess?
I would say it's a very small percentage overall, because we're starting with the LEA's enrollment projections. It's their own projections that they supply to us. And we really take those at face value. I would say that the disputes or disagreements, which would be really starting at a different perspective, often comes around adjacencies. Is an adjacent school functionally adjacent or not? We start at the IAC in the initial look by saying which schools are listed as adjacent in the facility inventory database that the LEA provided. And those are generally the ones that are just actually physically connected right next door. But we know that in some cases there are geographic dividers, like there's a creek and there's only one bridge, right? So to get from school A to B, you'd have to go really far out of your way, and it's not walkable for an elementary level child, or or there's buses don't go there. So when an LEA says, yeah, that's an adjacent school, but it's not functionally adjacent, we just ask them to show us why, and we look at that and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course, that's not functionally adjacent. And we just had a school come up recently for a project in which there are 4 adjacent schools, and we found that only one portion, small portion of one of them was functionally adjacent. The other 3 were not, so they were eliminated. And there was only this one narrow area that could have been
I
considered
got you.
adjacent.
Madam Chair, I'm gonna take my question offline. I'm not sure the first question was fully answered, but I'll ask the director offline.
I got it. Thank you. Delegate Corman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A bit of a follow-up to Senator McCrae's question. Can someone tell me the process in, let's say, St. Mary's County for redistricting between adjacent schools? If I have 10 slots in elementary school A and I'm 10 over in elementary school B, how do I move the 10 from A to B at the school district level?
Well, that's a Board of Education solution. It's an administrative decision. They look to see what their capacities are. It's their portfolio of schools, their budgets that they're operating within. We're not involved in redistricting.
Right. Okay. So they've come to you to try to do a capital solution, and your response back to them is you can redistrict those 10 students.
It could be. It would certainly be a question if it was an obvious question why there's not an administrative solution. Why does there have to be a physical building solution? Because if we do a physical building solution, we could have double the square footage to maintain than we did before the solution.
Now, in most cases, actually in every case, there's matching dollars the school districts have to put up for this capital, correct? I mean, in some cases it's 50-50, in some places it's 10-90. I mean, it depends. Just for the eligible costs anyway, usually they're actually putting up even more money because a lot of costs aren't eligible. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So it's not as though they're coming to you for free money saying we don't feel like redistricting, we want to build. They're putting their money where their mouths are, right?
Is that a question?
Yeah, it ended with a question mark. They're putting their money where their mouth is by coming to you saying we want to do a capital solution here.
It's they're developing a project and they have money to go towards it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Grohl. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think that was a yes. All right. I don't see any more questions, and I'm gonna interject here to say that we have been absolutely given a lot of data. For the committee, let me just say this. We have heard now over 2 work group meetings. One, the presentation on the actual physical analysis of school buildings, HVAC systems, so on and so forth, floors, windows, doors, how they were ranked and rated. And now we have a presentation today, which boils down into 9 categories, basically with buckets within them, how the IAC proposes measuring education sufficiency. I want to thank, first of all, the IAC and our consultants for really a tremendous amount of work. And I want to thank them for this, this presentation. But I also want you to know that it is at least my view, and I believe the view of the majority of us on this work group and the public, that we have some input into the proposed categories, and that this is only a starting point for the work group. I think you could tell that by some of the questions that were raised. It is up to this work group to determine the final Maryland Index or MDCI categories and their priority. That's going to be the job of this work group. And then in what capacity this Maryland Index should be used in funding decisions. As a work group, we can decide whether or not we want to add categories, break categories down into subcategories, or keep all 9 categories as originally proposed by the IEC. But in the end, I think it's important to understand, all of you, each member, that this work group will make the final decisions. We can begin discussions now. There's been many questions raised, but what I would like to propose, since we have been literally inundated with a lot of information, is that each of us take the next month to work through this data and to discuss any questions that you have with staff. I think it's really important that we all understand going into the October meeting how the FCI and educational sufficiency standards flow into each category, and any changes that you would want to make based on the data collected from this assessment. Then in October's meeting, we can have a very productive conversation with all work group members, thinking through each of the categories and prioritizing these categories. I would further like to suggest that in November, once we've had a robust discussion, and each of us understanding these categories and how they impact the overall assessment. In November, I would like the work group to take our preliminary decisions into the field. I think it would be helpful for us to spend a day or two in November to actually go to schools based on the work group's discussions at our October meeting, to really see and really feel if we are comfortable with our choices. We need to be comfortable with the categories and their priorities so that the Maryland Index truly reflects what we believe to be a condition of the school. And so with that, I will stop and see if there are any further comments or questions. Delegate Corman, do you still have your hand? Okay. Yes, Mr. Willis.
Just a quick question. So the materials that were supplied today to the work group, they're going to be available for local facility planners and other in the counties to be download, or how are you going to share that information with them?
This is Michelle Lambert. I'm staff to the work group. All of the materials that you received are on the hearing schedule for this work group's meeting and can be found as well if you go to the MGA website and click on the work group's name. So everything you have is public.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that John Magoon from MAVE would be asking me that question. Where are the materials? So thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it.
And not that I'm trying to give her too much work, but if you have any questions, it is Michelle that you should call and work through. County Executive Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we get a lot of information without a lot of notice, so I really haven't had enough time to absorb what we got yesterday. So I do think having time to absorb it is good, and so I truly appreciate that. I do obviously consult with my own school system to try to get an understanding of what's happening, because I know our schools best. So they've been given at this point, my understanding, the draft FCIs for each of their schools. And they've sent back data, but they haven't got back corrected data. They haven't yet got back the space sufficiency information. So they're still a ways from having all the information themselves. So the data, I think, is important, and certainly our facilities planners understand all this much better than I do, and maybe some of the others. So do we have timing on when all of that information will be available to our school system so that we can maybe have some, so at least I can at least gain some better understanding of how this is going to work, or maybe we can get an example of a real school and work it through from beginning to end. Maybe it's a school we visit. That might be helpful. So I just think if we're going to make decisions that impact how schools are funded for, school construction is funded for many years, I personally think I need to have a better understanding of how it works. That's all.
Michelle, you want to try to take that?
Yeah, I'll defer to Bob and BV about the timing and what the LEA's seen and commented on.
Yes.
Yeah, and Alex and I think Tom or Bill. We had a couple of questions. One was they received some information that they had some questions on and requested some revisions. And the timing of that, I thought we were complete with that or almost complete. So if you could answer that question first, Bill or Tom.
Yep, so that is complete. The last questions that we got in were from Maryland School for the Deaf. So, and that was late August. So we've revised and responded to all comments that we've received from the LEAs.
Okay. And then the second question is, when can we put the data out? I believe that would be the FCI data for the individual school systems. And Alex, where are we with that schedule?
So our plan is to get that out by early next week at the very latest. That's FCI by system data to add to what the LEAs received last month, which was FCI by school. And then we can also schedule and generate pursuant to Bill and Tom's technical side, the space sufficiency data to go out very shortly thereafter, so that those are all in one easy spreadsheet for the LEAs. I want to note, though, that both the condition and the sufficiency numbers at the deep level on every school were available all through July and August to the LEAs on screen on a school by school basis. So the LEAs had access to all those numbers for each school on a school by school basis. It simply wasn't in a large single list or spreadsheet as we're sending out now.
I want to make it clear that the LEAs are busy. There are multiple funding sources coming from all different directions, and they're trying to figure out how to best use them and utilize and apply for them. So everybody's busy, and if somebody hasn't seen something, just let us know.
Okay, County Executive. What I can do, by the way, County Executive, I can follow up with you after this meeting to make sure that any timing or issues that you might have get met before the October meeting. But I do think we have been given a lot of information, and
yes,
we should take this time to work with staff and to make sure that we are in agreement with, because there were a number of questions and I didn't ask mine because I knew I was going to do this, but to basically take some time so that we all understand the material, we all understand the impact it'll have on school funding, and know that it's within this work group's charge to make those decisions. We make those decisions. So each of us on this work group will have not only input, but a vote. Okay?
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I'll follow up with you, Jan, early next week. Okay? Okay. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, again, to our IAC, Bob, and your Alex and your crew, thank you so much. This was very informative. Your materials, at one point, you're going to get a laugh out of this. I texted Michelle and I said, are they going to go through all 119 slides? Because I thought maybe I should, send out for dinner or something like that. Thank you for this abbreviated presentation, but it was very helpful. And again, we will do a lot of our own work independently and together through this month and come back in October with a robust discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thanks
Thank
to
you.
the appropriations staff as always.
Thank you.